Hey friends, Sheila here, and today we're talking about how to train for a bike tour and also how not to train for a bike tour, because I've done both. This is a really common question for people who are new to cycling or new to bike touring. They're wondering how much do they train, how do they train, and I really think there's no one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to training. It's really going to be individual to the person, the tour planned, and the type of experience you want to have. At the end of the day, I think what training for a bike tour comes down to is you're trying to make your tour as fun and safe as possible. And what's needed to make that happen is going to vary from person to person. But the three most common issues I would say we're trying to prevent by training for a bike tour is injury, saddle sores, and mental fatigue or overwhelm. When we suddenly go from cycling very little or not at all to cycling really long distances day after day, we can end up with injuries in all different parts of our body. Number two is saddle sores, which occur because of that kind of constant pressure between our skin and our saddle. And then number three is mental fatigue and overwhelm. We can't forget that cycling every day, yes, it's draining on our bodies, but it can also be really draining and overwhelming for our brains, and we want to train our brains to be ready to deal with these long distances of cycling. So let's chat about how we can train for our next bike tour. Please keep in mind, I am not a doctor or a personal trainer. I can't say what will be right for you. I'm just sharing my own personal experience. All right, let's dig in. Step one is getting some basic cycling experience on your bike. A lot of the steps we'll discuss after this can kind of vary depending on the tour you have planned and the type of experience you want, but this step number one I think is pretty key no matter what tour you're planning. It's really important to make sure that you are comfortable riding the bike that you are going to ride on that tour. And I say this as someone who did not listen to this piece of advice, and I will share that story at the end of this video. But please learn from my mistakes. It is really important that you have spent some time riding on your bike, that you're comfortable with it. Because if your seat doesn't fit or your handlebars feel weird, that might be something that you aren't able to change on your tour. They might not have the alternative you need at the bike shops that you pass by on your tour. So making sure that your bike is set up how you want it to set up, how feels good to you, is super important. It's also important spending some time riding on that bike so you are a safe rider. If you don't feel comfortable on your bike and how it maneuvers, you could end up getting hurt. So I think it makes way more sense to practice on your bike in your home turf rather than trying to get used to this new bike in a new place. Step two is to ask yourself, how important is it that you finish this route in a set amount of time? If you have plenty of time for your tour and you kind of have a loose route and you're planning to kind of make it up as you go, then you might be able to do some of your training during your tour. Although I still think it's important that you have enough experience on your bike and have ridden enough kilometers that you can comfortably get yourself between points. You don't want your next campground or town to be so far away that you have to push yourself past your comfort level and potentially risk injury or saddle sores trying to get yourself somewhere. So no matter what, you still need to have done a decent amount of cycling. But if you know that you have X amount of days to get from point A to point B and you need to make a certain amount of kilometers every day to make that distance, then training before you set out for your tour is key. So ask yourself, are you willing to take it easy for the first chunk of your tour and go slow and build up your mileage and your intensity? Or do you really want to hit the ground running, cover a lot of distance the whole tour, in which case you're going to have to do more training ahead of time in order to avoid risking injury? So once you have a sense of this, we arrive at step three, which is to slowly build your distance and intensity. And this applies whether you are planning to do some of your training on tour or whether you're doing all of your training beforehand. you need to slowly build that distance and intensity. It's really important that we take time to let our bodies and minds adjust to this distance we're trying to cover. There are plenty of plans you can find online, or you can work with a personal trainer. The idea is to slowly build your distance week after week so that you can build to the longest distance you're going to do. If you're training in the winter, a bicycle trainer can help you build up that distance indoors. And as you're slowly building up that distance, don't forget about the gear you're going to be carrying too. Cycling 80 kilometers with or without bags makes a really big difference. Carrying gear affects your effort, your speed, and also your balance. So getting in some training rides with your gear on your bike can be a big help too. Step 4 is to ask yourself, how important is it to you that you feel comfortable on the types of terrain and in the weather conditions you might encounter? Training or not, we can encounter all kinds of road conditions and weather conditions on a bike tour. But it can be helpful to check in with yourself about how you're going to feel in those different situations, and if you want to build up some training and experience so that you feel more comfortable. When you're on a bike tour, your route can take unexpected turns, and so you might end up on sand or gravel or mud or snow, and you might end up biking in the rain or the wind, and you might be dealing with traffic as well. So are you somebody that just says, I don't care, I'm excited for the adventure, I want to tackle all of that? Or are those situations going to make you feel stressed or overwhelmed, and preparing a little bit ahead of time will help you feel better? I know for myself, when I headed out on my first bike tour in Europe, I had done a lot of cycling, I was pretty confident, but I didn't consider that almost all the cycling I had done was on roads. And I remember when I hit this first stretch of mud and I was so overwhelmed, I nearly cried. And I just look back at little baby Sheila and know that a little bit of training in those kind of conditions ahead of time could have made a big difference. I don't regret it, it was part of the adventure, but it's something to consider. And of course we can't control what we're going to experience on the road, but ask yourself if a little bit of training in different areas might help you feel better overall. And a last bonus step is not to forget about other areas to train. Yes, we think about the fact we're going to be cycling and how we need to train for that, but there are some other areas that can be trained as well. For instance, how to eat and drink on a long ride. And obviously you can practice this during your training rides. It can truly be dangerous to not eat and drink enough when we are cycling all day. And so figuring out what foods work for our bodies, how often we need to eat, how often we need to drink can be really helpful to learn ahead of time. Secondly, if you're planning to camp, it might be helpful to practice camping ahead of time. I remember how overwhelmed I was preparing to solo wild camp for the first time on my first tour. I had never camped on my own, I had never lit a camping stove, and I figured it out, but thinking back, I don't think it would have hurt to spend a little more time preparing myself for how to camp. And lastly, we could probably benefit from a little training in how to change a flat or make other basic bike adjustments. These are things that can be really stressful to figure out on the road in a new place, and practicing ahead of time might really help us have a smoother tour experience. So those are some ideas for how to train for a bike tour, but as promised, I will also tell you how not to train for a bike tour. On my last bike tour from Toronto to Montreal, I was so excited. I hadn't been on a tour in a year. I had been dealing with recovering from wrist surgery, and so I was just so excited to get out there. I was so focused on my wrist healing that I didn't really think about anything else. I had a brand new bike. I had set it up differently so that it wouldn't hurt my wrists as much, but that threw the rest of my geometry off. My bike was ready for me to ride a couple days before I headed out for the tour, and with the time off that my partner and I had, we had to cover a certain amount of distance in a certain amount of time, and so we were doing really long days from having done maximum 10 kilometers a day on my commuter bike, not on the bike I was riding. After about 4 days, my knee started to bother me. I was able to finish the tour, but it has kept flaring up ever since. So I have really learned my lesson, and I highly recommend training enough for a bike tour. We live and we learn, and I sure learned from that one. So that's been my experience. Definitely let me know in the comments below what your experience has been training for bike tours, if you have any favorite tips to share with fellow cyclists. That's it for this one. Thanks. Have a good one. Bye.